Hey, it's Derek from Board Game House, where we play board games on the internet for you. Also RPGs, which is what we're talking about today with Matt Finch, the writer and creator of Swords and Wizardry. Swords and Wizardry is a retro clone of the original RPG that would become Dungeons and Dragons. It's a snapshot of the rules as they were in Zero Edition in 1978. Swords and Wizardry contains all of the rules needed to create a character, play the game, and run monsters all in one book. The current Kickstarter contains 4 books that break up the original Swords and Wizardry into a player's book, a book of spells and magic, a book of monsters, and a referee book that's essentially a DM guide. There is also dice and a handful of other tools for the best Swords and Wizardry experience possible. There's also digital accessories like individual books for spell classes that have all the spells just for each class and decks of cards with the spells that go with each, as well as a book of more monsters and an adventure called Baron's Gambit. Swords and Wizardry is available for free just as the main book and as a PDF at froggodgames.com. Let's just start with the basics. What led you to putting Swords and Wizardry together?
Okay, well, all right. That's a big back in time step because
Sure.
the game's been around for quite a long
Right.
time. Back in 2007, back in 2006, I wrote what was the first retro clone called Osric, which was basically it was the rules of first edition D&D rewritten so that there weren't any copyright violations, and so that was a big project. I wrote, most of the first book on that, the rules part, but mainly, the thing was just the legal analysis of, how can this be done? So that was not me being creative, other than as an attorney. The I can't claim any credit for that. And then Swords and Wizardry was a couple years later, and the reason I did that was because the person who owned one of the forums that I hung out at played original D&D, and he was really sick and has since passed away. And he was saying, hey, could you do one of these for original D&D? So I did, and that was Swords and Wizardry, and it is since it's basically what I play at
Sure.
this point. That worked out pretty well. And now fast forward to all the way, what is it? More than 10 years later, I guess. The reason for doing it now is simply that we are, we've done several printings of it. We're running out of the last printing that we did. And we sort of said, okay, let's step back and take a look at, what is it that the people who play want to get. And what we got out of that from talking to people was, number one, let's do a box set.
Sure.
And let's do it digest size, because that's the way that original D&D was sold, was in a little digest size box, which I've probably got one back on the shelves with a couple of them. But and then the stuff that's coming afterwards, to do a more of a supporting line, because I've never been in favor of doing additions, because this is basically it's a rewrite of an existing game, and I'm not trying to put my own house rules into that, but we'll do some supplements that have, okay, here are some house rules you could put in.
And everybody's going to do it on their own anyway, so
oh yeah, I mean that's the original D&D thing, and it's always been strong with Swords and Wizardry too, is that it's a tinkering box for people who want to start with a simple role-playing game and then make it whatever it is that they want to be from there.
Absolutely.
I mean, taken by itself, it's a very light, streamlined role-playing system. It has a lot of a different feel to 5th edition, even though somebody who's playing 5th edition is going to be able to recognize, this is the framework. But I mean, it's been used to come out with a game called Woodland Warriors that was sort of, based on Mouse Guard when that came out. And it's been used for Hulks and Horrors, which was somebody doing their homage to Warhammer 40K. It's been used as the spin-off for lots and lots of other games in different genres. And I've forgotten why I started talking about that, but it's, we
were talking about why you put it together in the first place. But I think that's a great answer, and sort of a segue into my next question, which was one of the highlights, I think, of Swords and Wizardry is how quickly you can create a character and how quickly sort of the game moves, and especially the combat system, which to me, reading through it's very streamlined. Very much like a board game, which is what we focus on.
Yes.
And I was hoping that you could maybe expand on that a little bit because I love it. I mean, just the sort of skimming through that I've done since I picked up the PDF. I love how sort of modular the combat is in terms of everybody does this at one time, everybody does this one time, sort of in segments.
Right. I mean, that's definitely one of the ways in which it can be done. Original D&D didn't have an initiative system in it,
Yep.
which was probably the major, I would even have to say flaw of the system. What we did in the book was say here are about 6 different ways that people did it. From talking from people who played in the day to looking at different books and different systems. So you've actually got 6 different combat board games included in there. But the one that I like is actually the most board game like because it's a phased initiative system, which is very different from what you see after that. And that's spells, missiles, and turning go. Then then melee goes, then movement goes, and then you can switch stuff around. And everybody around the table is doing whichever one of those things it is. So it's very much a phased system like a war game. But yeah, it's the combat system is, like you said, is very modular in a couple of different ways because a lot of the different classes have subsystems that because in a lot of ways the opposite of modular is elegant. Because if you have an overall elegant system like 3rd edition, and then also to a lesser degree 5th edition reintroduced some of the modularity on it, but when you've got an elegant system in there, it's a little bit harder to tinker with that because you change one thing over here and it may have law of unintended consequences over here when you apply that. Whereas if it's really clearly modular, thieves have percentages, whereas fighters roll D20s.
Sure.
You can be fairly sure that you can change one thing here, one thing there without having it spread out through the whole thing. So there's nothing. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with elegant games. It's got a much better adjective, but modular games have a lot to be said for them, especially for people who like to tinker around and stuff.
I mean, it's something that I really haven't seen in an RPG system, but I really like it. I'm actually starting a new game this weekend, and now I'm thinking that maybe I might toss a little bit of this in there just to test it out for me, just so I can play with it.
Sure. I mean, the only thing about the combat system and people who are more familiar with board games is that a lot of it is not covered by rules. It's not very granular at all. And so there's a lot of interpretation by the DM about what the effects of something are going to be. And that doesn't mean you can't say, here's what I think your probability of success is going to be. But, it's the DM who is creating a picture of things more. And so you in 5th edition, you might have somebody saying something like, I use my dash action. And, obviously a lot of people don't play at that level of, gaminess, but I use my dash action. Whereas in Swords and Wizardry, or really any of the older versions of it, you simply have somebody saying, I'm running forward. I'm going to try and, do a thing. And it's just sort of interpreted on the fly without having something that's got specific rules that are, here are bits and pieces of strategies and tactics that you can use. So people tend to look at their character sheet a lot less.
Yeah.
And they're thinking in the terms of, what would I do? What am I seeing? What am I doing? And then you get the more narrative, call it, description of it. So.
And that's what I'm super interested in because I find myself and I mostly didn't even notice it until I started sort of looking into this, was I didn't really understand how much I was combing through, these are my pages, this is what I can do. And I think it's very interesting. I think it's super cool. And I think that, once again, we're segueing into my next question, which is, why do you think that 5th edition players will enjoy sort of stepping back in time and going to these earlier origins? I mean, I think we've already answered it, but just exploring the game more.
Sure. Well, I mean, to paint with super broad brushstrokes, there are, in general, players who like granularity and certainty in their rules, and they want to put together something that is within rules. And then you have another group of players who really are generally annoyed by rules, mainly in the context of a role playing game, because obviously if you're playing Monopoly, you got to be willing to accept the rules. Sure. Pretty much just as a social contract around the table. unless you're the uncle who throws the board up in the air and the
Oof, you're hitting me hard with this one.
but and then of course there are some players who are just like, I'll play whichever one it is, which probably most people are, but certainly some people have a preference with one way or the other. And so what you have here is a game that, talking about D&D in general, you've got a game that has the same framework and skeletal context in both of the two versions, 5th edition and Swords and Wizardry. Mm-hmm. It's just that with Swords and Wizardry, you're way closer to the skeleton than a fully fleshed out,
sure.
A battle mech or person or whatever you want to think of in terms of how the game operates. And so so I would say that, the people who might sort of think about getting into or trying out Swords and Wizardry are people who feel like maybe a little bit of the fantasy element is not being optimized by having specific rules for what a character class does. Somebody who feels like, gosh, that's a little mechanistic, or just it's too complicated. If that sort of suite of reactions to 5th edition are going to suggest that, you might have some fun playing the same game, but as it existed at a much earlier time when that had not yet been grafted into the game. Mm-hmm. And it's a much, much more free form sort of, we're all just around the table, we're imagining things, and just playing a game that's fairly loose in terms of the rules interpretation. So that I think is really the key difference. And there are a couple of things that emerge from the rules as well, just from having a set of rules that tend to move faster, which is that in 5th edition, you tend to have to reserve a certain amount of time for combat because of the amount of time that a combat takes. Whereas in Swords and Wizardry, it's much, much faster, which means that you not only have time for sort of a more sweeping adventure simply because you're going to be able to do more combats, but it can also have some other aspects that tend to get downplayed for time reasons when you're playing, 5th edition or one of the later editions, which would be like, we're exploring, here are a bunch of, relatively empty rooms. We're getting a tactical map of a large, the so-called mega dungeon that's in there. But we can use that because if we're attacked from here, we know we can run around to here. We can put up a defensive bottleneck. And so that exploration aspect of the game tends to be more focused. And also the puzzle solving aspect of the game, I think, is better supported by the lack of rules that exist in Swords and Wizardry than by there are some numerical dice-based resolutions that affect puzzle solving in 5th edition. So your perception check basically gives you just passive radar without specifying what you're looking at. Your intelligence check can allow you to figure out how something works or what it may be intended to do. Whereas if you're playing one of the earlier editions like Swords and Wizardry, that's basically just proposed to you as a puzzle. There's not a way. Yeah, exactly. It's a player-based kind of game. A lot of the times people don't. You very seldom see, although you do see it, but you very seldom see somebody taking the approach of, well, my character wouldn't be intelligent enough to figure this out. Because what it is it's a much more, again, a bit more board game like. It's like, I'm the player. I've got my character out here. It's kind of like my pawn in a game, but this is me, the player, versus this world that's out there, and I'm trying to win, so that I can get my castle or whatever it is. So that problem solving player skill kind of aspect is it's different. It's not necessarily better one way or the other, but it's a very different feel to the game.
Right. I've watched an interview where you sort of talked about how important it was that Swords and Wizardry was free based on pay what you want. And I love that idea, because I think making stuff like this accessible to people, and I talk about this in the Kickstarter corner all the time, is if it's great to have a physical copy, but for a lot of people, it's just not economically viable. So sort of allowing people to get their hands on this stuff and have a good time for cheap or for not at all means that we're sort of expanding the hobby and just letting people have fun. And I love that idea. And like, I really respect, your opinion on it. And I love that I was able to get my hands on Swords and Wizardry, sort of the rules and like the book for free, But now I'm super intrigued to jump into the box set and get my hands on all that stuff just to
Yep.
have it because like I'm in love with the modular board game feel of it, but like now I'm stuck on nostalgia. Like this is what my D&D came from, and now I want to have every part of it so that I can have it in my arsenal to play later on.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's worth mentioning too. The box set that we're coming out with doesn't have any new shiny content
Right.
in the actual box. It's the same text, although it's fixed for things like which you'll see later in the book. But so because there's now more than one book, and it might not actually be later in that book. But but it's the same game content as what we've got out there for free. What for people who would rather have it in one large book, we still have some of those left. We're going to run out at some point, but it's the same content that's in there. But yeah, a lot of people, there are a lot of people who just like having a box.
Right.
Here's a box. I can shake it, and the dice that are inside are going to rattle. And it's just cool to have a box. And so that was that's there. So sometimes you make decisions when you're a game company that aren't really optimized for profit as much as they are. I really want a box that'll rattle dice. So
well, I mean, it works because I just checked a few minutes ago, and 956 people agree with you. You're 550%, towards your goal. People want this box set, and so you guys hit it on the head with what your people wanted. Moving on to the next thing, there has been a massive surge in the popularity of RPGs and tabletop in general. What do you think draws people to these time-consuming hobbies?
Well, for one, I mean, I think it's different things because for one, there's face-to-face contact for the people who are actually playing, around a table, and that I think is really a big deal. Again, I suspect I'm older than you. That used to be that used to be easier in terms of people getting together, and I think that the internet and whatever stuff it is, people tend to be way more isolated in their homes nowadays, and so there's a real value to that. And yet there are also a whole bunch of people who like to play on virtual tabletops, and and they haven't necessarily ever been in face-to-face contact with each other. They may have met playing Call of Duty or something like that, and then we were like, hey, let's play some D&D. How do we do that? Okay, here's Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds. Let's get together on there and play. And so that's not really face-to-face contact, but I think it's it's contact with people.
Right.
People have played video games for a long time. They've established communities of video games where people did stuff together, and board games and and even the virtual versions of this are a way of sort of stepping forward the human contact that's involved with that. So I think that's a big part of it.
The first game I ever DM'd was over a Google Hangout. It was me, and I had somebody in Texas, I had somebody in New Hampshire. We were all over the place, but we were playing D&D the same as you would if we were around the table. And I think you're right. I think that having that personal connection is so important, and that's why we love board games. That's why we are presenting them to people, so that maybe they can get their family together, get their friends together, and have that personal connection in person, face to face.
Yeah. I mean, there are tremendous benefits just to gaming. People sort of think, it's gaming, it's frivolous, but there are major benefits to it that are maybe not obvious to
Sure.
people, but they're, I think it's an absolute, I think you're doing a great thing trying to, spread out consciousness of the fact that here are these things out there. There are things that you can do. And I think that there's a whole lot of benefit to that.
Yeah. So now I want to sort of switch gears. So not necessarily talking about Swords and Wizardry anymore, but I want to talk about you. I want to talk about your history with D&D and RPGs in general. And the first, when did you start playing D&D?
It was 1978, and the reason I know that is that they did not used to have the blue. It was called the Blue Box basic set out there, one that was written by Dr. Eric Holmes. But I was in a model store because I did wargaming, so I was looking at the Napoleonic models. I was looking at the Lord of the Rings models, and I remember this thing. And they had the books. They had a monster manual. They had a player's handbook. I couldn't figure out what they are because a game is not a book. A game comes in a box. So there were these books out there, and I didn't quite understand what that was until here's this box set that comes out. And I know that it was 1978 because I remember when it came out, and I know that it came out in 78.
That was 14 years before I was born. So I don't have that sort of aha moment. Like, this stuff has always existed for me. So I'm so interested in talking to people who sort of picked this up right when it came out. So I think that's super cool, and I would love to dig in deeper, but we don't have time for us to have a 2-hour conversation about what D&D was like when it first started. But you can find out by picking up Swords and Wizardry, so there you go. My next question, do you have a favorite class? Like, do you have something that you always sort of tend to play?
Yes, I'm not one of I'm not one of the people who is like, yes, I dive into the fantasy and I'm whatever. I'm always a wizard.
You know what? I can see it, because you put a pointy hat on you right now, and I'm sold. I would follow you into a dungeon anytime.
That would be a really bad idea, because I'm also that guy who pulls the levers and pushes the red buttons.
Okay, so you and I shouldn't go in somewhere together, because we would be fighting for that chance.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, good. All right. In that case, I'll stand back and let you go ahead and push the button. I mean, I'm not suicidal. I just feel like every button should be pushed and every lever should be pulled.
You got to explore everything that's presented to you.
Exactly.
It was designed for a reason.
But yeah, I mean, if you can get somebody else to take the risk on that, then that works fine.
Do you have a favorite monster?
The Manticore.
Manticore. Well, mine is the Mimic, because they're great. You can put them wherever you want, and it's always a threat. But Manticore, they're scary as hell sometimes.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I like Manticores. So I've got some others. Somebody pointed out a couple of them, and I was like, "Ooh, yeah, that's a close second, but it's still a Manticore." So, yeah.
And then finally, and we can end on this one. Can you tell us about a character that you have played that has sort of stuck out to you? I've found that people love talking about their D&D characters. That you could talk to somebody for an entire evening just about their character and how much they love it. Is there one that you've played over the years that sort of sticks out to you?
Well, I mean, I think my favorite was, a magic user.
Mm-hmm.
It was by which I mean wizard for anyone who's coming into it later. There used to be only one real arcane spellcasting class, and it was called a magic user. They didn't have sorcerers and so on. But I had one called Tatterdemalion, which honestly, I think it's just because the name. I thought the name was so cool more than what he actually achieved. But yeah, that was a fun one. So.
Perfect, Matt. Thank you so much for coming on here and answering all these questions. I picked up Swords and Wizardry as the free PDF, and I look forward to getting my hands on the box set from the Kickstarter. You are a very cool guy. Even in this limited amount of time that we've been talking, I have enjoyed myself, and I've enjoyed watching your other interviews, and sort of, you have your own YouTube channel, correct?
Well, I do. I haven't done a lot with it. In fact, when we started this show, before you started recording, I was saying, how are you even doing this on Google Hangouts? Because once Google Hangouts went down and I didn't have a direct way of streaming to YouTube with more than one person on the thing, and having to learn OBS, or XSplit, the streaming software, and it became too many things to, move around minis, run a game, and or do an interview, whatever it was, and at the same time, stream. So, mad props for your multitasking ability, because I know that you're doing stuff, completely invisibly behind the scenes that is turning this into a recordable video. It was beyond me. So, so I haven't done a whole lot with the video, with the YouTube channel. I do have it out there. But for the most part, I've been focusing on the writing and just producing the stuff more recently.
Well, I mean, success. So congratulations on that successful Kickstarter. I think it's great. Go check out Swords and Wizardry. Matt, thank you so much. This was great.
And thank you for having me on the show. It's fun.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this interview with Matt, subscribe below and check out all of our other YouTube content. And you can also come join us live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/BoardGameHouse, where we play board games and RPGs and all kinds of stuff.